All right, hey everyone, Captain Bryce here. Just want to walk you through the preliminary report about the Air India crash. I thought it would be good to maybe just kind of look at it together. So here we are. I got the report right here, and I'm not going to read through all of it because it's really wordy and it goes through a ton of detail, like specifics of people and the aircraft and stuff like that. So if you want that information, obviously you can check it out as well. But I want to just go through this with you as someone who can help you maybe understand it a little bit more. That being said, it is pretty well written. I feel like most people would be able to at least get a good gist from it. But nonetheless, I want to kind of have a discussion here with this. So I thought just creating a video real quick would probably be the best way to do that. So let's just dive in. The forward here. Basically, I do want to emphasize this really quick. The information is preliminary and subject to change. So down here at the bottom, the use of this report for any purpose other than for the prevention of future accidents or incidents could lead to erroneous interpretations. So I'm not trying to make any assumptions with this. I'm just sharing with you the information. I'm not pointing blame at all, and neither is this report. Okay, so that's kind of the big takeaway from this. All right, so we got the contents. I'll just kind of scroll through this with you. I'll stop at the points that matter. So again, the general information, just like pretty much every detail you can imagine. The background, who it is, who does what, who they are, who owns the airplane, who's in charge of the investigation, all that type of stuff. Injuries, aircraft information, lots of information there. It does talk about what type of maintenance state the aircraft was in during the accident, and it was in a pretty good state as far as this document tells us. There were some what's called MELs on the aircraft, and that's a very normal thing. It's basically deferrals that are allowed that don't compromise safety. Okay, so we deal with those all the time, and in the future I'll create another video about dive a little bit more into those. But for now, there were some MELs, as we call them, some deferrals on there that were very, very minor. It goes through like the site, where it was. Kind of interesting, it goes through like where all the different pieces of the aircraft were found. By the way, this is normal investigation stuff that happens anytime there's an aircraft accident. They go through all of these details. So it lists where different parts of the airplane were found. Not to be too morbid or graphic, that's just what they're doing. They're just trying to gather data. Yeah, cool. We'll go through this. Again, just more information about where stuff was found. You're welcome to look at this on your own if you want. I don't feel like this gives us a lot of information that most people are wanting to know. Okay, so this is the part that I want to focus on right here. Of a couple things. So this is the flap lever. There have been some videos, excuse me, and some ideas out there that the flaps inadvertently got put up too soon rather than the gear, because the gear was out and it looked like the flaps were up, but this actually confirms, and so does the flight data recorder, that the flaps were in the correct position for the aircraft. The landing gear was down and it remained down. Now, normally we put the gear up, but in a situation like this where they started dealing with an emergency right off the bat, that became unimportant. That's something that they're not thinking about, is getting the gear up. They were thinking about trying to keep the plane flying. So in this case, yes, the gear lever was down, and that's, neither here nor there. It just is what it is. The thrust lever quadrant, this is probably the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway. So both thrust levers were found near the idle or aft position. However, the EAFR data, which is the computer that basically records every single piece of information of switch positions and things like that, and they get this data and they can actually load this data into a computer, and the computer will take all the data points, and you can actually, well, not you and I, but like the people watching it can actually see the exact movements of all the controls inside of the flight deck, because that's what's getting recorded. So that's where this information comes from. It's usually recorded in the black boxes with the cockpit voice recorder. So that stuff is on purposely saved and recorded in a crash-proof box for this purpose. So that's what this is talking about. The data that it's talking about is from that type of a recorder that's crash-proof. So that data revealed that the thrust levers remained forward or in the takeoff thrust until the impact, and that would be a normal thing. They were trying to get the thrust back. Both fuel control switches were found in the run position. We'll talk about that in a second, and that's down here. The reverse levers were bent, but were in the stowed position. The wiring from the toga switches and auto throttle disconnect switches were visible, but heavily damaged. So basically all that's saying is everything was in a position that it should have been in, which is kind of interesting because of what the preliminary report finds. So that's the actual information from what they found from the wreckage, and that will play in here in just a second. So information about the people, the conditions, I'm not going to go over that stuff. The area, like the airport, the actual times of the communication. These are the flight recorders that I was talking about. That's where all of this data is stored, and it's crash proof so that people can gather this data later on. Let me make sure I get to the part. Nope. Okay, the flight. I think this is where we need to check it out. Okay. All right, I'll start right here. So as per the EAFR data, that flight data recorder, the aircraft crossed the takeoff decision speed V1, which is just a speed that we have to get to before we know that we're gonna go into the air. I can talk more about that in another video. So it got to its normal speeds. The takeoff was totally normal. There was nothing wrong with it. The aircraft air-ground sensors transitioned to air mode, meaning it got into the air and the aircraft senses that, and that's normal. Aircraft have different modes for when the aircraft is on the ground and in the air for different systems. So consistent with liftoff. It achieved a maximum airspeed of 180 knots, which is normal for takeoff, but we usually don't stay at that low of a speed for much more than the first 30 seconds or less of the takeoff. Usually the first 1,000 feet or so. It depends on the procedures with this specific airline. And immediately thereafter, the engine 1 and engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transitioned from run to cutoff position one after another with a time gap of 1 second. Okay, so that's basically the finding right there, is that the fuel cutoff switches, which shuts off fuel to the engines, somehow got put in the cutoff position. Okay, let me scroll back up here. That's these switches right here. They're in the run position, and they were found in the run position, which we'll look at in just a second, but they did move to the cutoff position, so basically turning the engines off. And I know the big question on everybody's mind is why did they get cut off? And we'll look at that in just a second, but well, yeah, we'll look at that in just a second. Let me make sure I get to my spot here. Okay. The engine N1 and N2 began decreasing. So N1 and N2 is the fans inside of the engine, and that's the indications that we use inside of the cockpit. It's basically like an RPM gauge for the engine. That's a simple way of thinking of it. And that's what we use our thrust setting off of. So anyway, if N1 and N2 are decreasing, that just means that the fan is winding down, or the engine is slowing down. It's producing less power. So when we're at takeoff power, the N1 and the N2 values are at their highest for the flight. And when we go to idle, like on a descent or right before we land, that's when N1 and N2 go to their lowest values. So just to explain what that is. So the N1 and N2 began decreasing from their takeoff values as the fuel supply to the engines was cut off. That would be a normal thing. If you cut off fuel to an engine, it starts to shut off. It's not producing power anymore. In the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilots is heard asking the other, why did he cut off? Meaning, why did you cut off the engines? Why did you move those switches to that position to cut off? The other pilot responded, he did not do so. Okay. So that's really the interesting thing that hopefully some more information will reveal. The cause of this accident in the preliminary findings is that the engines basically got shut off in a way that they're never supposed to be shut off. And I don't fly this plane, but from what I've seen and heard from other people is these switches don't just shut off on their own. Okay. And so that's the really interesting part is how did they get there? Why did they get there? And that's probably the question that everybody's really asking, because the engines shutting off is the cause of this accident. And so then the next question is, well, what's the cause of the cause? Like, what caused them to shut off, which caused the engines to die, which caused the accident? And we don't have an answer for that yet. Okay, but let's keep looking at a few more pieces of information just so that you have all of it here. So the footage here showed the ram air turbine, or the RAT as we call it in aviation, getting deployed. And that's basically it's basically a windmilling turbine generator that produces electrical power using the airflow from the speed of the plane. Okay, it's the last source of backup electrical power so that the plane can still fly if everything else dies. And that's normal. Every single plane has one of those. That's normal if you lose all electrical power from a dual engine failure like this, for that to deploy like it did. So that was functioning normally is what this is saying. Okay, so let's keep going. Per the recorder, engine 1 fuel cutoff switch transitioned from cutoff to run, so it went back to run. Most likely one of the pilots put it back at that time. And this just talks about the APU, which is the electrical generator in the back of the plane that starts. That's usually what's running in the plane when you're boarding and stuff. You maybe see like a little bit of fumes coming out the back, and that's the APU running. So it's basically a mini engine that doesn't produce any thrust. It's just for air and electrical power. So then engine 2 fuel cutoff switch also transitioned from cutoff to run. When those switches go from cutoff to run while the aircraft is in flight, each engine's full authority dual engine control, or FADEC, automatically manages a relight, so that's restarting the engine, and thrust recovery sequence of ignition and fuel introduction. So FADEC is on most planes. It controls the parameters of the engine, and it's a really great thing, and it was doing what it was supposed to be doing. It was trying to relight the engines. Okay, the EGT, which is the exhaust gas temperature, was observed to be rising for both engines, indicating a relight. So that means it's lighting in there and it's getting hotter. So that means it's working, like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Engine 1's core deceleration stopped, reversed, and started to progress to recovery. So that means rather than winding down, it arrests that deceleration and is actually starting to turn back on, as we call it. It's to spool back up. Engine 2 was able to relight but couldn't arrest the core speed deceleration and reintroduce fuel repeatedly to increase core speed acceleration and recovery. So engine 1 was recovering, engine 2 sounds like it was not recovering. Okay. Anyway, then the Mayday distress call came out, and then that's when the aircraft collided. And then just some more information about the wreckage and the report, and then that's the end of the report. So there's some pretty obvious information here, and then there's some information that is leaving us all questioning. So like I've talked about, the obvious information is that the engines got cut off their fuel supply with those switches, and the question is why or how. So like I said, I don't fly this plane, and I don't know of any automated way that switch moves. The type of switch that it looks like those is a very common switch in airplanes, and I have those in the plane that I fly. And they're not a mechanically moved switch. They're more of a guarded switch, which means there's a certain way you have to turn it off. It can't just accidentally get bumped and shut off. And so that's the interesting part. Like I said, I don't know if I'm correct on that. Like I don't fly that plane, so don't quote me on that. But it is interesting, and it's interesting that they got shut off and then they got put back on. And just because it takes these engines so long to get started, they didn't have enough time. Because even if just one engine would have gotten started, that would have been enough to keep them flying and to be able to climb out slower than with two engines, but they still could have climbed out and recovered, but they just didn't have the time because of the fact that the engines got shut off so close to takeoff that they didn't have any time for them to recover. Let me review this. Okay, something else I do want to mention, because you'll probably see it in articles, is the FAA issued a Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, or a SAIB, back in December of 2018 regarding the potential disengagement of the fuel control switch locking feature. Okay, this was issued based on reports from operators of the 737 airplane that the fuel control switches were installed with the locking feature disengaged. So it wasn't considered an unsafe condition that would warrant an airworthiness directive by the FAA. Now, an airworthiness directive, or an AD, is a lot more serious of an issuance. Think of it kind of like a recall on your car that becomes legally required for you to comply with. So if the FAA ever issues an AD, an airworthiness directive, where they find something and they're like, "Oop, this needs to be changed," they will issue the AD and a time frame that it needs to be complied with. Otherwise, the airlines will get fined or shut down, or whatever the penalty is based on the AD. And so they usually give them a reasonable amount of time, and it depends on the severity of it, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, maybe longer, maybe shorter. Because they also aren't trying to like shut down the airlines, but they do want them to implement it as quick as possible. So they try and balance that. Just like a recall on your car. It's not like imperative that you get it done right away, but it probably is a good idea to get it done sooner than later. So anyway, an airworthiness directive is when it becomes legal that it has to be complied with. And SAIB is just basically like information like, hey, we found this and might be worth looking into, but not required. So anyway, as per the information from Air India, the suggested inspections, so the SAIB, were not carried out, as the SAIB was advisory and not mandatory. So technically there's nothing wrong with them doing that. It's easy for us to look at that and be like, oh, you guys should have done that and looked at it and stuff like that. Maybe, but there's probably lots of other airlines out there that didn't do it either, because it's not required. So it's hard to say. And it's hard to say if that even would have fixed the issue, because we don't know why those shut off. So this is just the report pulling in pieces of information. They could be completely uncorrelated. Let's just say that the switches did get bumped, for example. Not super likely, but just for example's sake. Let's say they did get bumped and, got bumped into that cutoff position somehow and shut the engines down. Then this SAIB would have nothing to do with the accident, even though it seems related. So I'm just making that point that this is just pieces of information that they're pulling in, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's related. So the fact that Air India didn't do these inspections doesn't necessarily mean that, because they didn't, that's what caused the accident and they should be held accountable. We don't know that yet, okay? So I just wanted to point that out. That's kind of the last piece of information that we know. So the big question on everybody's mind, I'm sure, is like, hey, is it still safe to fly? Is Boeing still safe? And that type of stuff. And my answer is yes, absolutely. It's definitely still safe to fly. And I think if you're flying on a 787, you should still have confidence that it's a safe plane. There's nothing in this accident that really points to anything yet that means like, oh man, something's wrong with Boeing or something's wrong with the 787. I know Boeing has been in the news a lot lately, but personally, I fly on them all the time. I ride on them all the time. I don't hear any other pilots who fly them talk about any worries that they have or anything like that. So you kind of have to sort through what the media is saying versus what's actually happening. And just as a reminder, there's over 110,000 commercial flights every single day. And if you average 150 seats in those, some planes have less, some planes have more. So I'm just throwing out a number, 150 seats. Let me do some quick math here. 150 times 110,000, that's 16.5 million people that fly every single day. Every single day. And one accident does not at all mean anything about the safety of aviation. It gets a lot of attention from the news, as we're seeing right now, and it is really interesting and it's really intriguing to us because it's so rare and because it's such a big deal. But just remember, as you're looking into this stuff and probably hear things over the next couple days on social media and stuff about this, is flying is definitely still safe. You can have a lot of confidence in it. And it's something that there's so much more regulation, so much more layers of safety than most people know about, which is why I created the Fly Without Fear course, is because I go over that. I go over what's normal. I go over, pilot training and what causes turbulence and weather and how much wind is too much and how our airport's designed to help and all that type of stuff, so that your mind and your brain can be armed with this information that's empowering to you, like the 110,000 commercial flights per day, the 16.5 million people that fly every single day. Once you get some reality checks and some real information, it starts to just naturally kill off the anxiety and the fear and these thoughts of like, oh man, flying's not safe anymore because something happened. You can much more easily start to kick those out the window and be like, actually, no, it's still really, really safe. Kind of to wrap it all up, it's just sad that it happened. And then now we just have to wait and see what the cause of the cause was, meaning what caused those switches to go from run to cut off. And that really is the big question, I think, that needs to be answered and hopefully can be. I don't know what information they'll be able to gain from that or to be able to prove that. But the takeaway for all of you is flying is definitely still safe. I do it. I would put my family on a plane. I would go out and fly. So I hope that you can have that confidence as well. Thanks so much for watching. And I plan to make some more videos like this. And if you made it all the way to the end, definitely please subscribe. I'm building my channel right now. There's not a lot to it, but I would appreciate the subscription from you to help me know how much interest there is, and I'll keep creating some more videos like this. Thanks guys, calm skies.